In this video, we're going to look at text box objects, and we're also going to do a little bit of work with number objects. So let's first talk about a text box. This is the code for creating a text box in our HTML. So it's the input tag, and we're putting type equals text, and the type equals text is what makes this an input, a text box. So there are lots of different input types, and this one happens to be a text box. And we're giving this one an ID of first name, and that's going to come up here in a little bit. We'll actually have to use this ID to identify which text box we're looking at. Here's another one, another text box, input type equals text, and this one has an ID of sales amount. So let's take a look at some of the methods and properties that we can use on a text box, and then we'll actually see some examples of using some of these. So there's the focus method. And if I call the name of the text box and I say dot focus, it will actually move the cursor into that text box. If I use the name of the text box and I say dot select, it'll highlight all the text in the text box. Probably one of the most used ones that we use is the value. If I have a reference to a text box and I use dot value, it will give me back a string that represents whatever has been typed in that text box. So we use this one to pull out the value of things that have been typed into a text box. There's also a disabled property. The disabled property is a Boolean value. And if we would set that to true, we're making it disabled equal true. We're disabling that text box so a user can't type anything into it. And if we set disabled to false, it will not be disabled anymore and the user will be able to type into it. So those are a couple properties we can use with a text box object. And the other thing we're going to look at on one of the methods from the number object that we'll look at in some upcoming slides is toFixed. And it's a way of rounding a number with decimals to a certain number of decimal places. And actually you can use it on whole numbers too, but it's generally used to like set things to 2 decimal places or a single decimal place. All right, so we're going to be using these 2 text boxes. We have to assume that these are 2 text boxes on the HTML page that we're working with inside that document. And then we would do something like this. We talked about in a previous video about the query selector method on the document object. So what we're doing here is calling document.querySelector, and basically we're getting a reference out to the item on our web page that has an ID of first name. And if I go back, ID of first name is that text box where we want the person to type their first name. So query selector gets a reference to that text box that has first name on it, and it stores that reference in this variable called first name. We declared this variable first name. Right now, first name, after this line runs, we'll have a reference to that text box. Okay. And then we're going to use the dot value property of first name, which is that text box. We're pulling out its value now, and we're storing just the value of the text box back in the same variable of first name. Okay, so kind of 2 steps there. Find the object and then pull its value out. And both times we're putting the result in first name. So the first time we do this, that's a reference to the text box itself. Then we're taking the value of the text box and storing it back in the same variable. Now we can do this with something called chaining. Rather than doing this step 1, step 2, we can write it all in one line and say something like constant first name equals, and then we're saying document query selector first name, and then take its value, kind of all in one step. It still happens in this order. It queries the selector, it finds the first name text box, pulls out its value, and stores it directly in first name. Okay. This is the exact 2 things we did up here, written with one statement. Let's look at the parseFloat method to get a number from a value in a text box, because value in a text box is, of course, text, or it's a string is another way to look at it. So here we're working with the second text box on our page, which is the sales amount, which we would expect to be a number with a variable name like that. So we're querying the document, saying, give me the HTML element that has an ID of sales amount, and we're storing a reference to that in the sales amount variable that we create. Okay. Then we're going to take that reference to that text box, and we're going to say, give me the value out of that text box, and just store that back in the same variable. Okay. Now that value will be stored in this variable as a piece of text. Okay. If I want to use it as a number, I also have to take that value and parse it as a float. So now I've converted it to a number and stored it back in the same variable. So sales amount has changed its data type. That's something important to understand here that JavaScript does, is it's dynamically typed language. Right here, it's a reference to an object. It's a reference to a text box object. Okay. When we convert it, when we get the value out, sales amount's now a string, and then we parse it as a number, and sales amount will now be a number. In this case, a floating point number. Okay. And we can do all three of these things with one statement. So we have a parseFloat, and inside the parseFloat is a document query selector. So we're going to query for that particular text box. We're going to pull out its value, and then we're going to parse it as a float and store it back in the sales amount variable. Both of these statements, these three statements and this single statement, accomplish the exact same thing. We've just combined all those with chaining into one single statement. Let's look at some other examples of chaining. So let's see what this one does. Here's the toFix thing that we talked about from the number object that lets us round something to 2 decimal places in this case. So we're document query selector. We're finding the object on our page that has an ID of sales amount. That's in these parentheses, this parenthesis and that parenthesis. And we're getting its value, and then we're parsing its value to a float, and then rounding that float to 2 decimal places and storing it in sales amount. So looks like 4 things are happening there, all with chaining. Here's another one with chaining. Hey, find the object on our page with an ID of first name, set its value equal to an empty string. So this one, rather than pulling the value out of that box, it's setting the value to an empty string, which clears out any contents that might be in that text box. And then here's an example using the focus method. Hey, find the text box called with an ID of first name. We assume it's a text box because that's what our examples have been. And set the focus to that control, and it'll basically stick the cursor into that text box. All right, so we're going to stop there for this video, and in the next video we're going to look at date and string objects.